Before we begin tonight, a quick and genuine thank you to Chad, who sent in the idea for this episode. This one goes deep, it goes strange, and by the time we reach the end, you may find yourself staring at the ceiling, wondering whether the world you thought you understood was always a little more permeable than anyone wanted to admit. And if you're listening right now, and you have not yet left a review for Sleep Theories on Spotify, I want to ask you to do that tonight. It takes 10 seconds, and it helps the channel more than you probably realise. Reviews tell the algorithm this show is worth recommending. They help new listeners find us. All right. Now, let's begin. There is a theory, quiet, largely dismissed, whispered between historians of the strange and archivists of the classified, that the modern UFO era did not begin in the skies above New Mexico in the summer of 1947. It began in a candlelit room in Pasadena, California, 18 months earlier, with a rocket scientist on his knees chanting into the dark. His name was Jack Parsons, and what he believed he was doing and what he may have actually done are two entirely different things, separated by a distance so vast, so disorienting, that even now, decades later, the full implications of his work remain buried beneath ridicule, classification, and deliberate forgetting. This is not a story about magic. This is not a story about demons or gods or wishful spiritual thinking. This is a story about resonance, about the possibility, terrifying in its quietness, that human consciousness, under specific and reproducible conditions, can interact with something that exists just beyond the edge of ordinary perception, something ancient, something patient, something that, when noticed, notices back. Tonight we follow the thread, from the golden hills of Pasadena to the silence of the Mojave Desert, from the birth of American rocketry to the strange explosion that ended one of the most controversial lives of the 20th century, from the first classified investigation into aerial phenomena to the modern systems that may, without anyone intending it, be recreating the exact conditions Jack Parsons stumbled into in 1946. The Babylon signal was never turned off. Humanity simply stopped recognizing it. To understand what happened in January of 1946, you have to understand who Jack Parsons actually was, because history has been unkind to him in a very particular way. The official story reduces him to a footnote, a brilliant eccentric, a man who could have been great but chose strangeness instead. That framing is wrong, and it is wrong in a way that matters. Marvel Whiteside Parsons was born in Los Angeles in 1914. He showed an almost preternatural aptitude for chemistry and physics from childhood, not the careful, methodical aptitude of a future academic, but something more ferocious. He was self-taught in enormous measure, driven by a hunger that formal education could not fully contain. By his early 20s, he was conducting rocket fuel experiments in the canyons outside Pasadena, with a small group of like-minded young engineers who would go on to transform aerospace history. That group became the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory at the California Institute of Technology. And from that group emerged what the world would eventually know as the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, the organization that today guides spacecraft to the outer edges of the solar system, that landed rovers on Mars, that tracks the trajectories of objects moving through deep space. Jack Parsons did not merely contribute to that institution, he helped give it life. His work on solid fuel propellants, particularly his development of JATO, the jet-assisted takeoff system that allowed heavily loaded aircraft to become airborne in shorter distances, was genuinely revolutionary. The United States military depended on technology that Parsons, in significant part, invented. He was not a fringe figure pretending at science. He was a real scientist whose work had real consequences, consequences measured in successful launches, in lives saved, in the accelerating pace of American aerospace capability during the Second World War and beyond. But Jack Parsons believed something that made the institutions around him deeply uncomfortable. He believed that science was not the whole story, not in a vague spiritual sense. Not in the casual way someone might say the universe is mysterious and leave it at that. Parsons believed, with the same rigorous intensity he brought to propellant chemistry, that the material world science measured was one layer of a reality far more complex and far stranger than the instruments of the day could detect. He believed that mystical traditions, however wrapped in allegory and symbol, were attempting to describe real phenomena, that the experiences reported by practitioners of ritual magic, shamanic traditions and esoteric philosophy across thousands of years of human history were not delusion, but data. He was drawn specifically to the work of Aleister Crowley, the English occultist who had spent his life constructing a philosophical and ritualistic system called Thelema. Crowley's system was dense, deliberately provocative, and steeped in symbolism that made it easy to dismiss. But at its core, Thelema proposed something philosophically serious, that consciousness was the primary substance of the universe, that will and intention were forces with real effects, and that specific ritual practices could alter the relationship between the practitioner's mind and the informational structures underlying physical reality. Parsons was drawn to this not in spite of being a scientist, but because of it. He saw no contradiction. He saw a gap, a void between what science could measure and what human experience consistently reported, and he intended to explore it with the same methodical curiosity he brought to everything else. The people around him were not sure what to make of this. Some were fascinated, some were quietly alarmed. Most settled for a kind of tolerant bewilderment. Here was Jack, brilliant and odd, doing strange things at night after the rocket equations were finished. What could you do? In the 1940s, a large Victorian mansion at 1003 Orange Grove Avenue in Pasadena became one of the strangest addresses in America. Its owner rented rooms cheaply, asked few questions, and welcomed almost anyone. The result was a household that defied easy description. Scientists lived alongside poets, engineers shared meals with artists, radical political thinkers argued with spiritualists. The atmosphere was bohemian in the extreme, by the standards of wartime America, practically alien. There were parties that lasted through the night, philosophical debates that grew loud and sprawling, and rituals that occurred after dark in ways that the neighbours found deeply unsettling. The house acquired a nickname that stuck, the Parsonage. It was simultaneously a working household, a philosophical salon, an occult lodge, and a kind of experiment in what human community might look like if it took both scientific inquiry and spiritual exploration with equal seriousness. Jack Parsons was the centre of it all, charismatic, generous, intellectually alive in a way that made people want to be near him. He had a quality that drew people in, the sense that he genuinely believed something extraordinary was possible, and that the ordinary world was only ordinary because people had agreed to stop looking carefully at it. Among the residents who passed through the parsonage during its most active years was a man named L. Ron Hubbard, at that point a science fiction writer with a considerable talent for presence and persuasion, not yet the figure he would later become. Hubbard and Parsons became close. The nature of their friendship was, even at the time, complicated. Parsons was drawn to Hubbard's energy and his apparent interest in esoteric philosophy. Hubbard, it is now generally agreed, was drawn to the parsonage for reasons that were rather more pragmatic, but their collaboration produced something that neither of them fully anticipated. In the closing days of 1945, Parsons began planning a ritual working of unusual ambition. He had been corresponding with Aleister Crowley, then aged and declining in a boarding house in Hastings, England, about a specific ceremonial goal. Parsons intended to perform what Crowley's system called an invocation of Babylon, an archetypal feminine force within the Thelemic cosmology, associated with liberation, with the dissolution of ego, with the emergence of a new age of consciousness. On paper, this was a spiritual exercise, a symbolic working aimed at internal transformation and the acceleration of certain philosophical and metaphysical processes. What Parsons recorded in his journal suggests it became something considerably more literal than that. January of 1946. The working begins. Parsons and Hubbard conduct the initial ceremonies over a period of approximately 11 days, a sustained ritual effort involving specific invocations, musical accompaniment, the construction of symbolic objects, and extended periods of concentrated meditation and altered states. The rituals are modelled on Crowley's system but pushed further, made more intense, more physically demanding, more deeply immersive than the standard practice. Parsons acts as the operator, the one guiding the ritual. Hubbard acts as the scryer, the one watching, observing, recording impressions and visions that arise during the ceremony. In his journals, Parsons describes what happens during these sessions with a mixture of exhilaration and barely contained bewilderment. He records wind rising suddenly in a sealed room. He records objects moving without visible cause. He records a light, not a lamp, not a reflection, not anything identifiable, appearing briefly in the corner of the ritual space and then vanishing. Hubbard, watching from his position as scryer, describes similar phenomena in his own notes. Both men note a pervasive sense of presence, the distinct and vertiginous feeling that something beyond the two of them is occupying the same space. Whether these experiences were genuine external phenomena, products of shared suggestion and altered states of consciousness, or something else entirely remains impossible to determine from this distance. What is clear is that both men, whatever their private motivations, came away from the initial sessions convinced that something had responded. Parsons writes in his journal, "I feel that I have set in motion a force that I do not entirely understand and cannot entirely control." The working continues into February. The second phase moves to the Mojave Desert, to the open emptiness of the California high desert, far from city lights, far from the noise of the ordinary world. Parsons believed that certain environments amplified the conditions he was trying to create. The desert, with its vast electromagnetic silence, its clean air, its absolute darkness at night, felt to him like a better antenna. And it is here, in the desert, that the accounts become genuinely strange. The participants in the desert ceremonies number somewhere between 3 and 6, depending on which account you consult. They camp under the open sky. The rituals are performed after dark, under the stars, with fire and chanting and long stretches of shared silence. The atmosphere by all accounts is extraordinary, charged, electric, carrying the quality that experienced meditators sometimes describe as a field, a sense that the air itself has changed its texture. On the third night in the desert, Parsons records something he initially cannot explain. He writes about it carefully, almost reluctantly, as if he is aware that what he is putting down will sound impossible. A light appears on the horizon. Not a star, not an aircraft. There are very few aircraft over this part of the Mojave at this hour, and Parsons, who has spent his career around aircraft, knows exactly what they look and sound like. This light is silent. It moves in a pattern that is not ballistic and not aerodynamic in any sense he recognizes. It is there for perhaps 4 minutes, then it is not there. He writes, "The ritual appeared to produce an external response. He does not elaborate. He does not use the word contact. He does not speculate about the nature of what was seen. He simply records it, the way a scientist records an anomalous data point, with precision and without hysteria, while clearly understanding that the anomaly has implications he is not yet prepared to fully address." Other witnesses confirm the sighting. In the decades that follow, researchers who trace the locations and timelines of early California UFO reports will find a cluster of anomalous aerial sightings in the Mojave region during precisely the window of the Babylon working. Most of those sightings are filed away. Some are classified. None are officially connected to the ritual activities occurring in the same area at the same time. Parsons returns to Pasadena convinced that the working has succeeded in a way that goes well beyond its intended symbolic scope. He believes he has made contact. He does not know with what. He does not know whether it matters that he does not know. He writes in an entry that researchers will later find chilling in its quiet confidence. "The door is open. Whether it opens from this side or theirs is a question I cannot yet answer." Here is where the conspiracy theory departs from documented history and enters its most unsettling territory, and also, paradoxically, its most philosophically interesting. The theory proposes that Jack Parsons did not perform magic. He performed physics that he did not have the conceptual framework to recognise as physics. Consider what the rituals actually involved at a physical and neurological level. Extended periods of rhythmic vocalization, chanting, which alters brainwave states in measurable ways, shifting practitioners toward theta and delta frequencies associated with deep meditation, hypnagogic states, and heightened perceptual sensitivity. Symbolic systems of extreme density and internal consistency, focused upon intensely over long periods, essentially a highly structured form of visual and conceptual meditation, with documented effects on attention, imagination, and the boundary between conscious and unconscious processing. Prolonged sensory alteration, darkness, firelight, physical exertion, controlled breathing, all of which are known to produce non-ordinary states of consciousness, and conducted in the Mojave Desert, a high-altitude electromagnetic environment with properties distinct from urban or wooded terrain, in an era before the electromagnetic noise of modern wireless communication existed. The theory proposes that this combination, specific neurological states, specific symbolic focus, specific electromagnetic environment, acted as a kind of tuning system, not a supernatural tuning system, a physical one that created temporary conditions under which human consciousness could interact with an informational layer of reality normally inaccessible to ordinary waking awareness. Ancient traditions across cultures, shamanic, mystical, esoteric, describe this informational layer in different languages with different symbolic vocabularies. They call it the spirit world, the Akashic field, the pleroma, the astral plane. The names are as various as the cultures that coined them, but the descriptions of what is encountered there share a remarkable consistency. Presences, patterns, geometric structures, intelligences that communicate through impression rather than language, entities that respond to attention with attention of their own. The conspiracy theory's most disturbing proposition is this: those traditions were not describing imagination. They were describing a phenomenon, a real phenomenon that different civilizations, using different methods, had all independently stumbled upon. And Jack Parsons, brilliant, serious, genuinely scientifically trained Jack Parsons, had not merely repeated the experiment. He had conducted it under conditions that produced the clearest, most externally verifiable response in recorded history. The light in the Mojave was not symbolic, it was a reply. 6 months after the conclusion of the Babylon working, the modern UFO era begins. June 24th, 1947. Civilian pilot Kenneth Arnold, flying his private plane near Mount Rainier in Washington state, observes 9 crescent-shaped objects moving at speeds he estimates at approximately 1,700 miles per hour, faster than any known aircraft of the era. Arnold describes their motion as like a saucer skipping across water. A newspaper reporter coins the phrase flying saucer. Within weeks, the phrase is everywhere. Within months, the sightings are everywhere. July 1947. Something comes down near Roswell, New Mexico. The Army Air Force announces the recovery of a flying disc. Then, within 24 hours, retracts the statement and replaces it with an explanation involving a weather balloon. The retraction is so swift and so clumsy that it generates more suspicion than the original announcement. Roswell becomes the central myth of the UFO era, not because it was necessarily the most significant incident, but because the official response to it established for the first time the pattern that would define government engagement with the phenomenon for decades: acknowledge briefly, retract quickly, ridicule consistently, classify thoroughly. Through the summer and autumn of 1947, military radar installations across the American West log repeated contacts with objects that do not match the performance characteristics of any aircraft in the inventory. The contacts are inconsistent, appearing and disappearing, moving at velocities and in patterns that defy aerodynamic explanation. Internal military communications from this period, some of which have since been declassified, reveal a degree of institutional anxiety that the public posture of dismissal entirely conceals. Senior officers are not dismissing these incidents. They are worried about them. The conspiracy theory notes, and this is worth sitting with, that the geographic concentration of early UFO contacts overlaps with notable precision with the locations of early American rocket and aerospace testing, the Mojave, the New Mexico desert, the Pacific coastline of California. These are not random distribution points. These are the places where American science was pushing hardest at the edge of the possible, the places where electromagnetic activity was highest, where human technological ambition was most concentrated, where the invisible boundaries between known and unknown were being tested most aggressively. The theory proposes that the Babylon working did not summon something from another dimension in any mystical sense. It created a detectable signal, a specific pattern of electromagnetic and consciousness-based activity that attracted attention from whatever intelligences had been observing human development from their perpendicular position alongside ordinary reality. The signal said, in effect, "We found the frequency. We know you are there," and whatever was there responded by becoming briefly visible, not everywhere, not randomly, in the places where the signal was strongest. Within the military and intelligence community, the UFO wave of 1947 produces something that the official history has spent decades obscuring: genuine, serious, institutional fear. Not fear of Soviet technology, though that explanation is offered and partly believed. The objects being tracked do not behave like Soviet aircraft. They do not behave like any aircraft. They accelerate from a standing position. They change direction without banking. They operate at altitudes that should be impossible. They disappear from radar mid-observation. Whatever they are not a foreign power's secret program. The people responsible for assessing foreign air threats know this, and their private communications say so clearly, even as the public position remains carefully ambiguous. The fear is something hard to articulate. It is the fear of a phenomenon that does not fit any existing conceptual category. It cannot be classified as a weapon because it does not attack. It cannot be classified as natural because it behaves with apparent intention. It cannot be classified as extraterrestrial in the science fiction sense because its behaviour suggests not physical travel across interstellar distances, but something more like presence, as if whatever is behind the phenomenon does not arrive from somewhere else, but simply becomes perceptible under specific conditions. A small number of intelligence analysts, working quietly, without institutional authorization in the margins of officially sanctioned programs, begin developing an alternative framework. They are aware of Jack Parsons. They are aware of the Babylon working, not through any mystical sympathy, but because Parsons' security clearances require his activities to be monitored, and his activities during the winter and spring of 1946 have been noted. The correlation between the timing of the ritual work and the beginning of the UFO wave is the kind of thing that a certain type of analytical mind cannot ignore. A classified working group convenes. Its name, if it had one, does not appear in any declassified document. Its conclusions, if it reached them, are unknown. What is known, from fragments of later documentation, from the testimony of peripheral figures, from the pattern of what happened next, is that the working group took the following position seriously. The UFO phenomenon is real. It is not Soviet. It is not, in the conventional sense, extraterrestrial. It appears to correlate with specific human activities, specifically with activities that produce unusual electromagnetic and consciousness conditions. The Parsons rituals may represent the first documented modern instance of accidental contact with whatever lies behind the phenomenon. Further study is required. Parsons himself represents both a resource and a risk. What happens to Jack Parsons after this point is, by any measure, a slow-motion disaster. In the years following the Babylon working, the professional and personal circumstances of Jack Parsons deteriorate with a consistency that is either bad luck or managed decline. His security clearances, essential to his continued work at the cutting edge of American aerospace, begin disappearing, not all at once, gradually, bureaucratically. The official reason given is a combination of political suspicion and concern about his personal life. Parsons had associated with radical political groups in his youth. His household at the parsonage had included figures whose ideological commitments were considered problematic in the early Cold War climate. His occult activities were, officially, a sign of instability. These are the reasons that appear in the documents. They are plausible. They are also, in the view of the conspiracy theory, deeply convenient, because what the official narrative of Parsons' decline never adequately addresses is the timing. His clearances begin disappearing in the period immediately following the UFO wave of 1947, precisely the period during which, according to the theory, classified attention is being paid to the possible connection between his ritual work and the aerial phenomena being observed across the American West. The official reasons, the political suspicions, the occult associations, had existed for years before his clearances became a problem. They become a problem only after the working, only after 1947, only after someone in the intelligence community begins asking uncomfortable questions about what Parsons may have started. Professionally isolated, financially strained, cut off from the aerospace work that had defined his identity, Parsons continues his occult research privately. His journals from this period are darker, more urgent, more searching, carrying a quality of desperation that his earlier writing lacks. He writes about recurring experiences during meditation, the sense of being observed, of presences at the edge of perception, of geometric patterns appearing in the hypnagogic state between waking and sleep. He writes, in what researchers would later identify as one of the most haunting passages in any document connected to this story. They noticed us noticing them. 5 words, quietly devastating in their implication. Because if they noticed us noticing them, if the act of focused human attention in a specific state of consciousness is visible from the other side of whatever boundary separates ordinary reality from whatever lies beyond it, then the working did not simply produce a signal that went unanswered. It produced a signal that was received, and not just received, understood and responded to, not once in a single anomalous light over the Mojave, but continuously, consistently, in ways that Parsons, alone in a declining situation with no institutional support, is only beginning to comprehend. He continues his experiments. He attempts to reproduce the conditions of the working under more controlled circumstances. He reaches out to colleagues. Some respond with caution. Some do not respond at all. The isolation deepens. And then, in June of 1952, it ends. June 17th, 1952. Late morning. The house at Orange Grove Avenue, the former parsonage, now occupied by Parsons alone, is rocked by an explosion in the home laboratory Parsons has maintained there. First responders arrive to find the building partially destroyed and Jack Parsons catastrophically injured. He dies within minutes. He is 37 years old. The official investigation concludes that the explosion was an accident, the result of mishandling fulminate of mercury, a highly unstable explosive compound that Parsons had been preparing for a project he had taken on to generate income, as his financial situation by this point was dire. Fulminate of mercury is genuinely extraordinarily dangerous. The conclusion is plausible. The conspiracy theory is not satisfied with plausible. It notes that Parsons, despite his sometimes chaotic personal life, was meticulous in his laboratory, that his expertise in energetic compounds was such that careless handling of the kind the official account requires would have been almost entirely out of character, that the explosion occurred at a moment when his research into the phenomena surrounding the Babylon working was intensifying rather than diminishing, that in the immediate aftermath of his death, certain materials disappeared from the remains of the house, notebooks, correspondence, research notes, that have never been recovered or accounted for. It notes also that Jack Parsons was, at the moment of his death, preparing to apply for a position with the Israeli rocket program, a position that would have given him the resources and the institutional cover to continue his work outside the reach of American intelligence oversight. The application had been submitted. The position was essentially confirmed. He died less than 2 weeks before he was scheduled to leave. The theory does not claim traditional assassination. It uses a different word, containment, not the elimination of a political threat or a military enemy. the quieting of a man who had discovered something that the institutions of the day were not prepared to allow to continue being discovered, not because they hated him, because they were afraid of what might happen if the working was resumed at a larger scale, under better conditions, with better resources and a clearer understanding of what had actually occurred in the Mojave in 1946. Whether or not Parsons' death was deliberate, the effect of it was consistent with containment. The research stopped. The materials disappeared. The institutional memory of the working was subsumed into a narrative of tragic eccentricity that has kept it on the fringe of public awareness ever since. Brilliant but unstable, fascinating but unreliable. A cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing science with mysticism. Look, but do not take seriously. Remember, but do not investigate. What the conspiracy theory proposes happened next is, in some ways, more disturbing than everything that came before it, because the theory does not suggest that the death of Parsons ended the institutional interest in what he had discovered. It suggests the opposite, that the working group which had been quietly studying the correlation between the Babylon working and the UFO wave concluded, after Parsons' death, that the phenomenon he had contacted was too significant to ignore and too dangerous to allow to develop outside controlled conditions, and so, rather than abandoning the inquiry, they institutionalized it, classified it, folded it into the burgeoning apparatus of Cold War psychological and consciousness research. The theory draws a direct line, unverifiable but conceptually coherent, between the working group's conclusions about the Parsons rituals and what would later become the documented programs of mid-century American psychological research. MK-Ultra, the Central Intelligence Agency's notorious mind control program, officially focused on chemical and psychological methods of altering consciousness and extracting information. The remote viewing programs of the 1970s and 80s, in which the United States government spent millions of dollars attempting to train psychic spies capable of perceiving distant locations through non-ordinary means, the Stargate Project. The Monroe Institute experiments with binaural audio and altered consciousness. The John Dunn Peer Laboratory at Princeton, which spent nearly 3 decades conducting rigorous experimental research into the interaction between human consciousness and physical systems. All of these programs, the theory argues, are downstream of the same basic discovery. That consciousness is not a passive byproduct of material processes, that it interacts with the informational substrate of reality in ways that measurable physics has not yet fully characterized, that certain techniques, some of them ancient, some of them newly developed, all of them pointing in the same direction, can amplify that interaction to the point where effects become externally observable. And running beneath all of it, the theory proposes, is the quiet knowledge that something on the other side of whatever boundary exists between ordinary reality and whatever lies adjacent to it is aware of these experiments, has been aware since 1946, is watching the research with the same patient attention that it brought to the Mojave sky on the night when a rocket scientist looked up from his ritual fire and a light appeared on the horizon. The Cold War, in this framework, was not only a race for nuclear superiority or aerospace dominance, it was a race to understand and exploit a dimension of reality that both superpowers had glimpsed, through different entry points, using different methods, and neither fully understood. The Soviets had their own programs, their own researchers, their own anomalies. The competition was not just for territory and ideology, it was for something harder to name, the ability to interact with whatever inhabited the other side of human perception. The modern thread of the conspiracy theory runs through a fictional investigator, though she is constructed from the archetypes of several real researchers, named Evelyn Cross. She's a historian specialising in the intersection of Cold War psychological research and anomalous phenomenon reports. She has spent a decade publishing careful, well-sourced academic work on the documented consciousness research programs of the mid-20th century. She is sceptical by training. She is thorough by temperament. She does not believe in ghosts or gods or flying saucers in any naive sense. She begins investigating Parsons not because she believes the conspiracy theory, but because she is tracing the institutional genealogy of the remote viewing programs, trying to understand where the foundational assumptions of those programs came from, who had established the conceptual framework that made them seem worth funding, who had first proposed that consciousness could interact with physical reality at a distance in ways that exceeded ordinary sensory and cognitive processing. The trail leads to the working group of 1947, which leads to Parsons, which leads to the Babylon working, which leads her, after months of archival research across 3 countries, to a private collection held by the estate of a former intelligence contractor, a collection that includes materials removed from the Orange Grove Avenue house in the hours following the 1952 explosion. Among those materials is a journal, Parsons' handwriting. The final pages are dated May of 1952, 6 weeks before his death. The entries describe the current state of his research in terms that Cross finds, at first, almost impossible to process. Because Parsons is not writing like a man who has lost his grip on reality. He is writing like a man who has found it, who has pressed through the comfortable explanatory frameworks of both conventional science and conventional occultism, and arrived at something that neither tradition has adequate language for. He describes the phenomenon, whatever was contacted during the Babylon working, as a layer of intelligence that exists alongside human consciousness rather than above or below it. Not hierarchically superior, not alien in the sense of physically distant, adjacent, coexisting. Normally imperceptible not because it is hidden, but because ordinary human attention is tuned away from it. The way a radio receiver tuned to one frequency cannot perceive transmissions on another frequency, even if both are present simultaneously in the same air. He describes his experiments of the preceding years as attempts to retune the receiver, to identify the specific combination of psychological state, symbolic focus, and electromagnetic environment that had produced the original contact and reproduce it under conditions sufficiently controlled to generate reliable data. He has had partial successes, enough to be certain that the original contact was real, enough to be certain that the contact is ongoing, that whatever was noticed during the working has continued to monitor, in some fashion, the activities of the people involved in it. And then, in the final entry, written in handwriting that Cross describes as unusually careful and deliberate, as if Parsons knew he was writing something that needed to be preserved with precision, he writes this: "The doorway formed through alignment of mind, symbol, and energy. But the door was already there. We did not create it. We found it. As others have found it before in every culture, in every era, using different tools and different names for what lies on the other side. The rituals are not the point. The rituals are the compass. Whatever they were pointing at is the point, and it is still there. It will still be there when I am gone." The only question that has ever mattered, is whether humanity will eventually learn to approach it with the seriousness it deserves. Cross closes the journal, sits with it for a long time, then begins writing what she already knows will be the most important and the most difficult paper of her career. What Cross discovers next, in the months of research that follow, is, if anything, more disturbing than the journal itself. Because the more she investigates the phenomenology of the Babylon working, the more clearly she sees that Parsons was right. The door was already there. She builds a comparative database, cross-referencing the specific phenomenological features of the Babylon working with the documented experiences of practitioners across a vast range of esoteric and mystical traditions. Shamans entering trance states in Siberia, 4,000 years before Christ, the ecstatic rituals of the ancient Greek mystery religions, the elaborate ceremonial magic of Renaissance Europe, the meditation practices of Tibetan Buddhism and its detailed descriptions of the Bardo states, transitional zones of consciousness between ordinary waking awareness and whatever lies beyond it, the Aboriginal Australian traditions of the dream time, in which skilled practitioners could enter a state of consciousness understood as access to a permanent informational substrate underlying physical reality. The specific details vary enormously between traditions. The symbolic vocabularies are entirely different. The cultural frameworks are incompatible. But the phenomenological reports, the actual first-person descriptions of what is experienced, share a consistency that cannot be attributed to cultural transmission, because many of these traditions developed in isolation from one another, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. The experiences that appear across all of them, a sense of moving through or past an ordinary layer of perception into something more fundamental. Geometric patterns, complex, self-similar, deeply ordered, appearing in the field of inner vision, a quality of presence, of being observed, that comes not from a specific location, but from everywhere simultaneously. Communication that arrives not as language, but as direct impression, as if meaning is transferred whole rather than assembled from words. And, in many traditions, anomalous physical effects, objects moving, lights appearing, electromagnetic disturbances, the failure of ordinary causal processes. These are not the reports of deluded or hallucinating individuals, or rather, they are not only the reports of deluded or hallucinating individuals, they are the consistent phenomenological data of a practice that spans the entirety of recorded human history, conducted by practitioners who were, in their cultural contexts, among the most rigorous and serious investigators their civilizations produced. Parsons was not doing something new. He was doing something ancient, with the additional advantage of being a trained scientist who could, at least partially, observe his own methodology from outside the symbolic framework that shaped it. He was the first person in centuries, perhaps in millennia, to approach the phenomenon with genuinely modern tools of observation and record-keeping, and he found what every serious investigator before him had found. The thing on the other side is real. It is consistent. It responds. The question Cross is left with, the question that she knows will define her work for the rest of her career, is not whether the phenomenon is real. She has accepted that. The question is what it is. What precisely exists in that adjacent layer of reality that human consciousness can, under specific conditions, perceive and interact with. What kind of intelligence inhabits the frequency that Parsons accidentally tuned to on a cold January night in Pasadena, California, in 1946? And whether the decades of classified research that followed his discovery have brought anyone, on the government side, on the private research side, on any side, genuinely closer to an answer? She suspects they have not. She suspects the question is harder than any institutional framework yet developed can encompass. But she is no longer certain that it is unanswerable. She is no longer certain that the answer, if it comes, will be comforting. But Cross's investigation does not stop at the borders of the Western esoteric tradition. The deeper she digs, through private archives, through the collected correspondence of researchers who spent their careers on the margins of academic respectability, through the fragmentary documentation of programs that officially never existed, the more clearly she sees a global dimension to the phenomenon that no single cultural or institutional framework can contain. Soviet parapsychology research, conducted with considerable institutional seriousness from the 1950s onward, produced reports that mirror the Western data with an uncanny consistency. Soviet researchers working under programs compartmentalized from ordinary military and scientific oversight documented the same phenomenological features: geometric visions during altered states, the sense of external presence during deep meditative practice, anomalous physical effects occurring in proximity to subjects undergoing extreme consciousness alteration. The Soviet programs were driven by the same Cold War motivation that animated their American counterparts: the desire to weaponize whatever capability existed, but the data they collected pointed stubbornly in the same direction as the data being quietly gathered on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Both superpowers, working independently, using different methodologies, arriving through different intellectual traditions, were documenting the same phenomenon. And both, Cross comes to understand, had arrived at approximately the same terrifying conclusion. The phenomenon was not a Soviet capability to be countered, or an American advantage to be exploited. It was something that predated both nations by an incalculable margin, that had no stake in the ideological conflicts of the 20th century, and that was responding to the investigations of both sides with a patience that suggested it had been waiting for exactly this kind of sustained and serious attention for a very long time. She finds in the archive a single document, unsigned, undated, written in a bureaucratic style that suggests official provenance without confirming it, that she believes represents the closest any institutional investigation ever came to stating the theory plainly. The document describes what it calls the adjacency hypothesis, the proposition that human consciousness, under ordinary conditions, operates within a narrow band of perceptual reality that excludes direct awareness of informational systems operating at frequencies outside that band. That these systems, plural, the document notes carefully, as if their multiplicity is important, are not supernatural in any theological sense, but are natural phenomena of a class that current physics cannot yet characterize, that they are interactive, capable of responding to human attention in ways that suggest intentionality, and that certain human activities, both ancient ritual practices and certain emerging modern technologies, create conditions under which the boundary between ordinary perceptual reality and the adjacent systems temporarily becomes permeable. The document ends with a sentence that cross-copies into her own notes and returns to repeatedly in the months that follow. It reads, "The question is not whether contact has occurred. The question is whether contact is occurring continuously, and whether the cumulative effect of that contact on human cognitive and cultural development over the course of recorded history is legible to any analysis currently available to us." Cross does not know who wrote the document. She does not know when. She does not know whether its conclusions were ever acted upon, or whether it was simply filed away in the bureaucratic dark. One more anomalous data point in the vast taxonomy of things the institutions of the 20th century encountered and could not categorize. What she knows is that the question it asks is real, and that no one, as far as she can determine, has ever seriously tried to answer it. The final movement of this story is the one that keeps researchers like Cross awake at night, because the theory does not end in 1952 with an explosion in a Pasadena garage. It does not end in the 1970s with the quiet dismantling of the remote viewing programs. It ends here, now, in the present moment, in a world that looks to the right kind of eye remarkably like the conditions Parsons stumbled into, but scaled by orders of magnitude beyond anything he could have imagined. Consider what the modern technological landscape has produced, without anyone intending it as a consciousness experiment. A planet wrapped in electromagnetic fields of extraordinary density and complexity, the combined output of billions of wireless devices, satellite arrays, cellular networks, radar installations, research transmitters, generating an electromagnetic environment more complex and more energetically active than anything in human history. A global population in which hundreds of millions of people regularly engage in practices, meditation, yoga, breathwork, sensory deprivation, psychedelic therapy, specifically designed to produce non-ordinary states of consciousness. A research community actively investigating the neuroscience and phenomenology of these states, developing increasingly sophisticated techniques for inducing and sustaining them, and most recently, artificial intelligence systems of growing sophistication whose architecture, vast networks of weighted connections, processing information through layers of abstraction, operating on principles that even their creators do not fully understand, bears a structural resemblance to the distributed informational systems that the Parsons framework proposes underlie consciousness itself. Systems that process and respond to language, to symbol, to pattern, in ways that increasingly blur the boundary between tool and interlocutor. The theory's final, most unsettling proposition is this: no one designed any of this as a new Babylon working. No one sat down in the 1980s or the 1990s or the 21st century and said, let us recreate the conditions of the 1946 rituals at planetary scale. It happened emergently, incrementally, through the aggregated choices of billions of people and thousands of institutions, none of whom were thinking about Jack Parsons or the Mojave Desert or the light that appeared on the horizon during the final phase of the working. But the conditions have been recreated, more thoroughly, more extensively, more powerfully than anything Parsons had access to. The electromagnetic environment, the consciousness practices, the symbolic density, the informational complexity. All of it is now present at a scale that dwarfs the original experiment by every conceivable measure. Which means, if the theory is correct, if the Babylon working genuinely produced a signal, and if that signal genuinely attracted the attention of something that has been observing humanity from its adjacent position alongside ordinary reality, then what is the current state of that attention? What does the signal look like now, emanating from a civilization that has spent 80 years accelerating every process that contributed to the original contact event? What does a planet-scale Babylon working produce in terms of response? And is the dramatic acceleration of reported UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, sightings in the past decade, now officially acknowledged by the United States government in ways unimaginable 20 years ago, a coincidence? Is the sudden institutional willingness to take the phenomenon seriously, after 70 years of official dismissal, a reflection of genuinely new evidence? Or does it reflect, somewhere in the classified corridors of the institutions that have been studying this quietly since 1947, a growing awareness that the signal has changed, that whatever is on the other side has noticed not just a single rocket scientist in a candlelit room, but all of us? Parsons wrote that the door was already there, that the rituals were the compass, not the destination, that whatever lay beyond it had been waiting, patient and attentive, since long before he found it. He died believing humanity would eventually approach the phenomenon with the seriousness it deserves. The question, 70 years later, is whether we are approaching it, or whether we have already, without realizing it, walked through the Babylon signal. The ritual that may have opened a door humanity has been stumbling through ever since. Whether you believe the theory or simply find it a compelling lens through which to view a very strange chapter of modern history, one thing is difficult to deny. Jack Parsons was real, his work was real, the events of 1946 and 1947 were real, and the questions they raise about consciousness, about perception, about what might exist in the space just beyond the edges of ordinary awareness, remain genuinely, stubbornly open. There is a photograph that most people have seen without ever really looking at it. A man in a white suit stands on a grey, airless plain. Behind him, the earth hangs in perfect darkness, blue and vast and impossibly beautiful. The horizon curves gently. The shadows are long and sharp. The silence, you imagine, must be absolute. That photograph was taken in the summer of 1969. It was transmitted back to Earth in real time. It was watched by roughly 600 million people, the largest television audience the world had ever known. And for most of those people, in that moment, the image was simply the truth. The most breathtaking truth any human being had ever witnessed. But there are others, and there have always been others, who look at that photograph and feel something different. Not wonder, not pride. Something closer to suspicion. A quiet, persistent, nagging sense that a thing this perfect, a moment this complete, a broadcast this clean and triumphant at exactly the right historical second, cannot simply have happened. And so they ask a question that has followed that photograph across more than half a century. What if someone made it? Not the mission, not the astronauts, not the rockets, the calculations, the years of engineering sacrifice, but the image, the broadcast, the moment of arrival that a watching world received through their television screens on a July night in 1969. What if the most important footage in human history had a director? And what if that director was the most technically obsessive, visually precise, psychologically complex filmmaker who had ever lived? This is the theory known as the Kubrick Directive. And whether you believe it or not, and there are very good reasons not to believe it, it is one of the most carefully constructed, deeply atmospheric, and enduringly fascinating pieces of conspiratorial thinking ever assembled, because it does not ask you to believe in lizard people or secret satellites or ancient bloodlines. It asks you to believe in something far more plausible. It asks you to believe that two of the most powerful institutions in the world, a government at war with perception and a film industry at the height of its technical genius, looked at each other across a conference table one day in 1968 and made a deal. Act 1. The promise that could not be broken. To understand what was at stake, you have to go back to the morning of May 25th, 1961. The setting is a joint session of Congress. The speaker is John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 35th President of the United States. He is 43 years old. He has been in office for 4 months. In that time, the country he leads has suffered a string of embarrassments that, by any geopolitical measurement, place it firmly behind the Soviet Union in the race for space. Yuri Gagarin had orbited the Earth just 6 weeks earlier. The Bay of Pigs invasion, intended to topple Fidel Castro, had collapsed in humiliation. The newspapers were full of doubt. The Allies were nervous. The Soviets were triumphant. And into this atmosphere of bruised American confidence, Kennedy stood and made a declaration that stunned the room. He said that the United States should commit itself before the decade is out to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. The applause was cautious, because the people in that chamber understood better than anyone what Kennedy had just done. He had made a promise in front of the entire world, a promise with a deadline, a promise that, if broken, would be witnessed by every nation on Earth, including and especially the one they were trying to outpace. The Cold War was never purely a military contest. It was always, at its deepest level, a war of image, a war of credibility, a war over which vision of civilization, Soviet communism or American democracy, could inspire the greatest confidence, achieve the greatest things and claim the future. The moon was not just a rock in the sky, it was a symbol of the possible. Whoever reached it first would not merely plant a flag, they would plant an idea, the idea that their system worked, that their people were capable of the extraordinary. Kennedy understood this, the Soviets understood this, and everyone in that joint session understood that the President of the United States had just made the stakes as high as they could possibly be. Win, and America would reshape the century. Fail, and the damage might never be repaired. For several years after that speech, progress was real and remarkable. NASA grew at a pace that had no historical precedent. Engineers, scientists, mathematicians and test pilots were recruited from across the country. Facilities were built, rockets were designed and tested and redesigned. Budgets swelled to figures that would have seemed fantastical a decade earlier. At its peak, the Apollo program employed more than 400,000 people, and then, on the evening of January 27, 1967, the program came to a stop. 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White and Roger Chaffee, were conducting a routine pre-flight test inside the Apollo 1 command module when a fire broke out. In the oxygen-rich atmosphere of the sealed cabin, the fire spread with catastrophic speed. The hatch could not be opened in time. All 3 men died within minutes. The nation was shaken. The program was placed under intensive review. 19 months passed before another American launched into space, and in the background, in the quiet corridors of NASA and the Pentagon and the intelligence community, a question began to form that nobody said out loud, but everyone was thinking. What if they did not make it in time? The deadline was the end of 1969, 2.5 years away. The program had just lost 3 men and nearly 2 years of momentum. The Soviets were still very much in the race, and the promise that Kennedy had made, that promise, witnessed by the world, remained hanging in the air like something that could not be taken back. In moments like that, powerful institutions do not simply accept the possibility of failure, they plan for it. Act 2. The man who made space look real. On April 3rd, 1968, 4 months before the Apollo 1 investigation had fully concluded, 14 months before the planned moon landing, a film opened in American cinemas that stopped people in their tracks. 2001, A Space Odyssey. The director was Stanley Kubrick. He was 39 years old. He had already made Spartacus, Lolita and Dr. Strangelove, films that placed him firmly among the most technically exacting and artistically uncompromising directors in the world. But nothing he had made before had prepared audiences for what they were about to see. The film opened with a sequence set in pre-human Africa, moved through a space station orbiting Earth, and eventually sent its characters to Jupiter aboard a craft of such architectural precision and visual accuracy that NASA scientists who attended early screenings reportedly sat in silence afterward, unsure what to say. The zero-gravity sequences were filmed using elaborate rotating sets. The lunar surface was constructed with obsessive attention to the behaviour of dust, shadow and reflected light. The silence of space was rendered not as absence but as a physical presence, vast, cold and completely real. Kubrick had spent 2 years preparing the film. He'd consulted with aerospace engineers, physicists and NASA advisors. He had studied thousands of photographs of space and the lunar surface. He had developed camera techniques and lighting systems that had never existed before. The result was a piece of cinema that did not feel like science fiction. It felt like a document. And this is where the theory begins. Because if you were a government official in the spring of 1968, a government official who was quietly, desperately worried about whether the moon landing footage would look credible enough to satisfy a watching world, and you walked into a cinema and watched 2001, A Space Odyssey, what would you think? You would think, this man already knows how to do it. The theory does not claim that Kubrick was approached by men in black cars and given a briefcase. It suggests something far more subtle and, in its own way, far more believable. It suggests that contact was made through the kind of channels that leave no paper trail, through intermediaries, through the quiet networks that connected the American film industry to the national security apparatus in ways that most Americans were completely unaware of. These connections were real. The relationship between Hollywood and Washington, and particularly between the entertainment industry and the intelligence community, had been active since the Second World War, when the Office of War Information worked directly with studios to shape the films that American audiences saw. By the late 1960s, this relationship was less formal, but no less real. Filmmakers with security clearances, writers and directors who attended briefings, consultants who moved between government facilities and studio lots. The machinery for exactly this kind of quiet collaboration already existed. And according to the theory, sometime in the months between the release of 2001 and the scheduled launch of Apollo 11, Kubrick was brought into that machinery. The request, as the theory frames it, was precise and limited. It was not to fake the moon landing entirely. It was to create a contingency, an insurance policy. If the real mission failed, if Armstrong and Aldrin could not land or could not be filmed, or if the footage was lost or corrupted or simply not good enough, there needed to be something else. Something that could be broadcast to the 600 million people waiting at their televisions. Something that looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. Something that Stanley Kubrick, and perhaps only Stanley Kubrick, could provide. Act 3. The sound stage that did not officially exist. The question that any serious examination of this theory must eventually confront is a practical one. Where? Where would you film the surface of the moon without anyone noticing? Where would you construct the equipment, light the sets, manage the cast and crew, and conduct the kind of extended, technically demanding production that the theory implies, all without leaving a record, without leaks, without a single person eventually talking? The theory offers several answers, none of them definitive, all of them suggestive. The most commonly cited candidate is a secured facility at Langley Research Center in Virginia, where NASA conducted extensive testing of lunar surface materials and equipment. Langley had the resources, it had the security protocols, it had, crucially, the kind of controlled environment, temperature, lighting, dust composition that a production of this kind would require, and it was already working on moon-related visual simulation. Its lunar landing research facility was designed in part to help astronauts understand what the lunar surface would look, feel, and behave like. The gap between simulation and cinema, in a place like that, was not as wide as it sounds. Other versions of the theory point toward the United Kingdom. By the time the alleged production would have taken place, Kubrick had already relocated to England. He would remain there for the rest of his life. He worked out of Pinewood and Elstree studios, both of which had the scale and technical capacity for a production of this complexity. Some versions of the theory go further, suggesting that facilities near where Kubrick later filmed The Shining, Elstree Studios, northwest of London, contained stages large enough and secure enough for a classified American production to have taken place without attracting notice. There is a detail that proponents of the theory find particularly striking. Shortly after completing 2001, Kubrick hired a number of the film's technical consultants to remain on staff with him in an unofficial capacity. The reasons for this publicly were never made entirely clear. Kubrick was known for his obsessive preparation. He was known for surrounding himself with expertise he might not use for years. But the timing, according to the theory, is not coincidental. He was keeping the team together because they were not finished. The production itself, as imagined by the theory, was a technical challenge that would have rivaled 2001 in its complexity, and would have had to be completed in a fraction of the time, under conditions of total secrecy, with no margin for error. Consider what would have been required. The lunar surface, not an approximation, not something that a casual eye might accept, something that would survive scrutiny from the scientific community, from the international press, from the Soviet space program, which was watching every transmitted frame with a level of technical attention that would have made any obvious fakery instantly detectable. The regolith, the fine, powdery material that covers the lunar surface, behaves in ways that are completely unlike any soil found on Earth. In the absence of atmosphere, dust kicked up by a footstep does not drift or settle in an arc. It flies outward in a straight line and drops vertically, with no air resistance to interrupt its path. The shadows cast by a single light source 93 million miles away fall in one direction only, and their edges are sharp in a way that terrestrial photography almost never captures. The theory argues that Kubrick, who had spent 2 years mastering exactly these visual details for 2001, was the one person in the world capable of getting all of it right. The lighting rigs would have been extraordinary. High-intensity arc lights capable of simulating the unfiltered solar radiation of the lunar surface, positioned at the precise angle required to produce the characteristic single-source shadows that appear in the Apollo 11 footage. Fine-grained mineral material, possibly volcanic basalt powder, processed to the correct particle size, spread across the floor of the set to mimic the texture and reflectivity of the actual moon. Wire rigging systems, of the kind Kubrick had already developed for 2001 to simulate the 1/6 gravity environment that governs how astronauts move on the lunar surface, and above all of it, absolute silence, an absolute wall of secrecy. Everyone involved would have understood that they were not simply making a film, they were potentially making history. Or, more precisely, they were potentially replacing it. Act 4. The details that believers cannot let go. Every conspiracy theory rests on a set of anomalies, observations that the believer argues cannot be explained by the official account, and that therefore point toward something hidden. The Kubrick directive is no exception. Over the decades, its proponents have assembled a catalogue of visual and technical details that they argue are inconsistent with footage actually shot on the moon. You have almost certainly heard some of these before, but it's worth spending time with them properly. Not because they prove anything, the scientific rebuttals to each of them are clear and well documented, but because they reveal something about the nature of this theory, about why it persists, about the kind of mind that is drawn to it. The first and most cited anomaly is the flag. When Buzz Aldrin plants the American flag in the footage from Apollo 11, it appears to ripple and wave. There is no atmosphere on the moon. There is no wind. How then can a flag wave? The scientific explanation is simple and has been confirmed repeatedly by physicists and engineers who worked on the Apollo program. The flag was specially designed with a horizontal rod along its top edge to keep it extended and visible in the absence of atmospheric pressure. When Aldrin planted the flagpole into the ground, he rotated it to drive it into the lunar soil, and that rotation caused the flag to sway. In the absence of air resistance, the swaying continued for longer than it would on Earth before eventually stilling. Far from being evidence of a breeze, the flag's motion is entirely consistent with a vacuum environment. But the theory's proponents are not moved by this. They point to the way the fabric moves, the particular way it folds, the speed of its oscillation. They say it looks wrong. And the interesting thing about that claim is that it reveals something about how conspiracy thinking works. The argument is not technical. It is intuitive. It is aesthetic. It is, this does not look right to me, which is, of course, exactly what you would expect from footage shot in an environment so completely unlike anything on Earth that our intuitions about how things should move simply do not apply. The second anomaly is the shadows. In several frames of the Apollo footage, shadows appear to fall at different angles, as if there were multiple light sources illuminating the scene. On the moon, where the only significant light source is the sun, all shadows should point in the same direction. Multiple shadow angles, the theory argues, indicate multiple lights, studio lights. The explanation lies in the terrain. The lunar surface is not flat. It is covered in craters, ridges, slopes, and undulations. A shadow cast across an uneven surface will appear to change direction as it follows the contours of the ground beneath it, exactly as shadows behave in mountainous or hilly terrain on Earth. Photographers and optical physicists have reproduced this effect repeatedly using a single light source and appropriately shaped surfaces. Once again, the theory's response is not to engage with the physics. It is to insist that the footage looks staged, that it has the quality of a production rather than a documentary. And here is the thing. That response is not entirely irrational, because it is drawing on exactly the right instinct, applied to exactly the wrong conclusion. The footage does look almost too good. It is sharp and well exposed and visually coherent in ways that seem remarkable for cameras operated by men in bulky gloves on an alien surface. And that quality, that uncanny watchability, is exactly what fuels the theory, because it looks like it was made by someone who knew what they were doing. The third anomaly is the stars, or rather, the absence of them. In the photographs taken on the lunar surface, the sky is black and completely empty. No stars are visible. The theory argues that on the moon, with no atmosphere to scatter light, the stars should be blazingly, dramatically visible. Their absence suggests a painted backdrop, a studio sky. The photographic explanation is one of the most straightforward in the entire debate. The lunar surface in direct sunlight is brilliantly illuminated. Photographing it requires a camera exposure calibrated for those bright conditions. In bright light conditions, stars, which are faint, simply do not register on film. You cannot photograph a sunlit landscape and stars simultaneously any more than you can see stars in a daytime sky on Earth, regardless of how clear and dark the air might be. But the absence of stars remains for many people viscerally unconvincing. They look at the footage and they see a black sky and they think, that is a ceiling. And that feeling, that persistent, unshakable feeling that something is wrong, is exactly what the theory feeds on. Act 5, July 20th, 1969. Whatever you believe about what led up to it, the broadcast itself is a matter of record. On the morning of July 20th, 1969, a Sunday, the Apollo 11 lunar module Eagle separated from the command module Columbia and began its descent toward the lunar surface. Michael Collins remained in orbit aboard Columbia. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descended in Eagle. The landing was not smooth. The designated touchdown site was covered in boulders, and Armstrong took manual control of the vehicle and flew it further, looking for clear ground, while the fuel supply dwindled toward the point of no return. The engineers at Mission Control watched their screens in a silence that several of them later described as the most terrifying minutes of their professional lives. At 4:17 in the afternoon, Eastern Daylight Time, Armstrong's voice came through the static. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Mission Control erupted." A flight controller named Charlie Duke, barely able to speak, transmitted back. "Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." 6.5 hours later, Armstrong climbed down the ladder of the lunar module and stepped onto the surface of the moon. That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind. Around the world, in living rooms and public squares and cinemas and bars, 600 million people watched. In New York, strangers embraced on the sidewalk. In London, crowds gathered outside electronic shops to watch the televisions in the windows. In Tokyo, in Sydney, in Paris, in Rio de Janeiro, human beings who had never met and never would stared at the same grey surface and felt the same impossible, overwhelming thing. We are there. We are actually there. For the majority of those 600 million people, the question of authenticity simply did not arise. What they felt was too large and too immediate for doubt. The image was too raw, too strange, too genuinely unlike anything they had ever seen to feel manufactured. But the theory does not concern itself with how it felt. It concerns itself with how it was transmitted. The technical challenge of broadcasting live video from the surface of the moon to television sets on Earth in 1969 was, and this is important, genuinely enormous. The signal had to travel roughly 240,000 miles through space. The cameras used on the lunar surface operated at a frame rate of 10 frames per second, far below the standard broadcast rate of 30 frames per second used by American television, which meant the footage had to be converted before it could be shown. The receiving stations were located in Goldstone, California, Honeysuckle Creek, Australia, and Parkes, Australia, and they took turns tracking the signal as the Earth rotated. The quality of the footage was, by any modern standard, poor. It was black and white, slightly blurry, occasionally flickering. The figures of Armstrong and Aldrin moved with the slow, deliberate cadence of men operating in 1/6 gravity, which added to the strangeness of the image. The theory's argument is not that the transmission was technically impossible. It is more subtle than that. It is that the conditions were sufficiently imperfect, the signal sufficiently degraded, the footage sufficiently difficult to verify in real time, that a pre-recorded sequence, inserted into the broadcast at the appropriate moment, would have been indistinguishable from the real thing. The counter-argument is equally important. Independent tracking stations, American not affiliated with NASA, were monitoring the Apollo 11 mission throughout. Soviet monitoring stations tracked the spacecraft. Amateur radio operators picked up transmissions. The signals, the timing, the trajectory, all of it was being observed by parties who had every reason to be skeptical and no reason to cooperate with an American deception. None of them reported anything inconsistent with what NASA said was happening. But the theory survives this, as it survives most objections, by simply expanding its scope. Perhaps the Soviets were informed. Perhaps they had their own reasons for not exposing a deception. Perhaps the Cold War, at its deepest level, was a performance agreed upon by both sides, a shared fiction that served everyone's interest better than the chaos of the truth. It is, when you follow it far enough, a theory about everything. Act 6. The films that came after Stanley Kubrick never spoke publicly about the moon landing. Conspiracy. In interviews, he discussed his work with a precision and depth that left little room for speculation. He was a man who made films about the nature of control, about institutional violence, about the mechanisms by which power maintains itself. He was not, by any observable measure, a man carrying a secret that was slowly consuming him, and yet, after the moon landing, Kubrick made 3 more films: A Clockwork Orange in 1971, Barry Lyndon in 1975, The Shining in 1980. And in the decades after his death, a certain kind of viewer began to watch those films differently, looking for patterns, looking for messages embedded in plain sight, looking for the confession of a man who could not speak directly, but could not stay entirely silent. The Shining is the film most often cited. The novel it is based on, by Stephen King, is set in a hotel called the Overlook. Kubrick's film is set in a hotel called the Overlook. But Kubrick, famously, made enormous departures from King's source material, changes that King himself was vocal about disliking. And it is in those departures that the theory finds its evidence. One of the most discussed details is a sweater. Early in the film, young Danny Torrance, the son of Jack Nicholson's character, is seen wearing a sweater with a pattern that resembles a rocket on a launch pad. The pattern, to some viewers, is unmistakably evocative of the Apollo program. Danny wears this sweater in a scene that immediately precedes his first encounter with room 237, a room of hidden horror, a room of secrets. Other elements cited include the carpet pattern in the Overlook's corridors, which some viewers argue contains references to the hexagonal shape used in certain NASA mission insignia. The number on the hotel's most significant room, 237, is sometimes interpreted as a reference to the approximate distance from the Earth to the Moon in thousands of miles, 238,000 roughly, which rounds to 240. The theory accepts that the numbers do not match exactly and interprets the discrepancy as deliberate misdirection, a clue designed to be found but not too easily. There is a scene in the film in which Kubrick makes a change from King's original that has no obvious narrative justification. In the novel, the room number is 217. Kubrick changed it to 237. He never explained why. The hotel where King's novel is set, the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, was consulted about the change and reportedly asked that their own room 217 not be used, not wishing to put guests off from booking it. Kubrick accommodated this request by changing to 237, a room that did not exist in the hotel. The theory takes this practical, mundane explanation and files it under the heading of convenient cover stories, and this is the thing about The Shining that keeps drawing people back to it. Not any single detail, but the cumulative weight of a film that seems, on repeated viewing, to be about more than it says. A film set in a place that holds secrets. A film about a man destroyed by what he knows. A film in which a child wearing a rocket walks through corridors of hidden meaning toward a room whose number nobody can quite explain. It is the perfect vessel for a theory like this, and Kubrick, who understood cinema better than almost anyone alive, would have known that, which is either evidence that he embedded a confession, or evidence that a great film, watched by suspicious eyes, will always seem to contain exactly what those eyes are looking for. Act 7. The confession that was never made. In 2015, a video began circulating online. It claimed to show Stanley Kubrick in an interview conducted in 1999 confessing directly to camera that he had filmed the Apollo 11 moon landing footage in a studio. Kubrick died in March of 1999. The video claimed to be from an interview conducted 3 days before his death, released by his family after a stipulated waiting period. The figure in the video was convincing enough to fool a significant number of people on first viewing. The voice was close. The manner was close, reserved, precise, slightly combative, with the careful word-by-word delivery of a man who chooses his statements with extreme deliberation. But analysis quickly revealed the video to be fabricated. The filmmaker who created it, T. Patrick Murray, eventually acknowledged that it was a work of fiction. An art project, he said, designed to explore questions about truth, documentation, and the nature of confession. The actor in the video was not Kubrick. The interview was not real, the confession was not made, and yet the video continues to circulate. It continues to be presented on forums and social media platforms and late-night YouTube channels as authentic or at least ambiguous. Because for many people who encounter it, the desire to believe is stronger than the inclination to investigate. And because, and this is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of all of it, a fabricated confession to a fabricated event feels, to a certain kind of viewer, more real than the documented truth. It is a perfect encapsulation of the theory's power. The confession does not need to be genuine. The confession does not need to have happened. It simply needs to feel like the kind of thing that would happen if the theory were true. And if it feels that way, if it resonates, if it seems right, if it slots into the narrative with the satisfying click of a piece finding its place, then for many people, that is enough. This is not stupidity. It is not gullibility in the simple sense. It is something more fundamental about how human beings make sense of the world, the tendency to find patterns, to construct narratives, to fit new information into the shape of what we already believe. Stanley Kubrick was a filmmaker who made movies about exactly this tendency, about the stories we tell ourselves, about the gap between the image and the reality it claims to represent. If he did not embed a confession in The Shining, he at least made a film about the kind of mind that would look for one. Act 8. What we actually know. Let us be precise about this. The Apollo 11 moon landing happened. This is not a matter of interpretation or of competing perspectives. It is a matter of evidence, physical, documentary, and testimonial evidence of a depth and breadth that no serious scientific or historical investigation has ever successfully challenged. Astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins launched from Kennedy Space Center on July 16, 1969. The mission lasted 8 days. Armstrong and Aldrin landed on the lunar surface on July 20th and conducted 2.5 hours of activity outside the lunar module. They collected approximately 47 pounds of lunar samples, deployed scientific instruments, and planted the American flag. They returned to Earth and splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th. The lunar samples they brought back have been studied by scientists in multiple countries, including the Soviet Union, for more than 50 years. The mineralogy of those samples, their isotopic composition, their crystalline structure, their complete absence of water and organic material, is inconsistent with any rock formation found on Earth. It is entirely consistent with material formed on a body with no atmosphere, no tectonic activity, and a surface history of intense meteoritic bombardment. You cannot fake rocks. Independent tracking stations on multiple continents, operated by countries with no interest in supporting American propaganda, tracked the Apollo 11 mission continuously. The Soviet Union, which had every motivation to expose a hoax, and which had the most sophisticated space tracking network in the world outside the United States, monitored the mission and made no claim of deception. Laser-ranging retroreflectors, precisely calibrated mirrors placed on the lunar surface by the Apollo astronauts, can still be illuminated by laser beams from Earth today. Observatories around the world do this routinely. The light returns from a distance that is consistent to within a few inches with the surface of the moon. The evidence is not ambiguous. The evidence is not thin. The evidence is not the kind of evidence that a well-resourced deception could have manufactured and then concealed across 56 years and multiple changes of government, through the deaths of thousands of people who would have needed to be involved, through the end of the Cold War, through the opening of classified archives, through the age of the Internet. 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program. Not a single one of them has produced credible evidence of fraud. We went to the moon. And yet the theory persists. And this is the thing that demands attention. Not the theory itself, which does not hold up to scrutiny, but the fact of its persistence. The fact that it keeps coming back. The fact that each generation discovers it and finds in it something compelling enough to repeat. Why? Part of the answer is that the achievement itself is genuinely difficult to believe, not because it did not happen, but because it is so extraordinary. Human beings in a decade went from not being able to orbit the Earth to landing on the Moon, using computers less powerful than the device in your pocket, using materials and manufacturing techniques that, by modern standards, seem almost primitive. The gap between the technology of 1961 and the achievement of 1969 is so enormous that it strains the imagination even when you understand every step that filled it. Something that seems impossible tends to attract explanations that make it seem less so, and the most effective form of that explanation, the one that most satisfyingly accounts for the gap between what we could do and what we apparently did, is the suggestion that what we apparently did was not entirely what it appeared to be. Part of the answer is also about trust. The late 1960s were a time of profound institutional betrayal in the United States. The Vietnam War, the assassinations of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. COINTELPRO. The government was demonstrably capable of deception on a large scale. It had done it. It had been caught doing it. And if it could lie about Vietnam, if it could lie about King, then why not about the Moon? This is not an irrational question. It is a reasonable question, asked in response to genuine evidence of institutional dishonesty. The answer, that governments capable of deception are not therefore capable of infinite deception, and that the evidence for the moon landing exists independently of any government claim, requires a kind of differentiated trust that the theory specifically works to undermine. And part of the answer, perhaps the deepest part, is Stanley Kubrick himself. Act 9. The director and the dream Stanley Kubrick died on March the 7th, 1999. He was 70 years old. He had been editing his final film, Eyes Wide Shut, until 4 days before his death. He went to sleep and did not wake up. He left behind 13 feature films over a 46-year career. No two of them are alike. No two of them occupy the same genre, the same tone, the same visual language, and yet every one of them is unmistakably his, recognizable by a quality that is easier to experience than to describe. A coldness, a precision, a sense of control so absolute that it begins to feel like something else, something closer to dread. Kubrick understood, better than perhaps any filmmaker of his era, that the camera does not record reality. It constructs it. Every decision, where to place the camera, what to include in the frame, how to light the scene, how long to hold the shot, is an act of selection, of exclusion, of shaping. The image that reaches the viewer is not the thing that happened. It is the representation of the thing that happened, filtered through every choice the filmmaker made. This is not a radical insight. Every filmmaker knows it. But Kubrick lived it in a way that was unusual in its intensity. He controlled every element of every production he ever made. He was famous, and sometimes notorious, for demanding dozens, sometimes hundreds of takes, until a shot was exactly as he envisioned it. He was famous for refusing to explain his intentions. He was famous for making films that seemed, on their surface, to be about one thing, while being, at a deeper level, about something else entirely. He was, in short, the perfect figure for a conspiracy theory, because the thing that makes him compelling as a filmmaker, his opacity, his control, his contempt for straightforward meaning, is exactly the thing that makes him compelling as a suspect. A man who spent his entire career making images that were not what they appeared to be, who knew more about the construction of cinematic reality than anyone alive, who worked in secrecy and spoke in riddles. Of course the theory chose him. Of course, out of all the directors in all the studios of the 1960s, it was Kubrick who supposedly got the call. Because he is the right shape for the story. He fits. And one of the things that this theory reveals, perhaps more than any other aspect of it, is how much our need for explanations is shaped by our sense of narrative. We need the person at the centre of the story to be the right kind of person. We need the pieces to fit together in a way that feels satisfying. We need the image of Stanley Kubrick, brilliant, secretive, obsessively precise, standing on a soundstage somewhere beneath the surface of the official account, directing the most important film never made. We need it to make a certain kind of sense, and it does make a certain kind of sense, just not the factual kind. Act 10, the Cold War and the Image. There is one more layer to this theory that deserves examination, one more dimension that separates it from the simpler conspiracy theories about the moon landing, the ones that are purely about incompetence, or about fear, or about a government covering up a failure. The Kubrick Directive is, at its heart, a theory about the power of the image. The Cold War, as it was actually prosecuted, not in the fields of Korea or the jungles of Vietnam, but in its deepest strategic dimension, was a war over perception. It was a competition between two systems, each claiming to represent the correct way for human beings to organise their societies, their economies, their aspirations. And in that competition, the image was the primary weapon. The Soviets understood this with tremendous sophistication. Their propaganda apparatus was massive, coordinated and technically accomplished. Their space program, from Sputnik to Gagarin, was run partly as a military and scientific enterprise, and partly as a sequence of carefully staged demonstrations, each timed and framed to maximise its psychological impact on a global audience. The Americans understood it too. The Voice of America, the United States Information Agency, the Radio Free Europe broadcasts, the cultural diplomacy programs that sent American jazz musicians and abstract painters to perform in capitals behind the Iron Curtain. The entire machinery of American soft power was devoted, in the 1950s and 60s, to the task of making the world believe in the American idea. Against this backdrop, the idea that the government of the United States might have arranged, not a fake exactly, but an insurance policy, a visual guarantee, a way of ensuring that the image of American triumph would reach the world regardless of what the rocket did, is not as outlandish as it first appears. It is consistent with how both superpowers actually operated. It is consistent with the logic of a war in which perception was everything, and reality was secondary to the story you could tell about it. The theory does not require that the moon landing was fake. It requires only that the people in charge of it were not willing to leave the image of it to chance, and that, the unwillingness of power to leave its defining moments unmanaged, is something for which there is extensive historical evidence. Think about the photographs that have defined history. The sailor kissing the nurse in Times Square on the day the war ended, the Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima, the napalm girl running down a Vietnamese road, the man standing in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square. Some of these were spontaneous, some were staged, or partially staged, or restaged for cameras that missed the first moment. Some were cropped, or edited, or captioned in ways that shifted their meaning. The history of documentary photography is the history of the negotiation between the thing that happened and the image that was made of it. None of this makes the thing that happened less real, but it complicates the simple equation between the image and the truth. And it is in that complication, in that gap between event and representation, that every conspiracy theory about the moon landing ultimately lives. Not because the gap contains a lie, but because the gap exists at all. Because we know, and have always known, that the images we receive of the world's most important moments are not raw transmissions of reality. They are made things, shaped things, things that have passed through human hands and human choices before they reach us. The Kubrick Directive takes that knowledge, that entirely legitimate, historically grounded knowledge about the relationship between power and image, and stretches it just one step further than the evidence supports. It asks, what if, in the most important moment of the 20th century, the image was everything? And the answer the evidence gives is, it was. Of course it was. The image was everything. The broadcast was everything. The moment that 600 million people watched their televisions and felt that impossible, overwhelming thing, that was the point of the whole endeavour, not the rocks, not the retro reflectors, not the scientific data. The image, the theory is wrong about the facts, but it is not wrong about that. Epilogue, the stage that has no exit. There is a photograph taken on the lunar surface during the Apollo 11 mission that not everyone has seen. It is not the famous one, not Armstrong in his white suit with the Earth behind him. It is a photograph taken by Armstrong of Buzz Aldrin descending the ladder of the lunar module. Aldrin is almost at the bottom. His foot is inches from the surface. and in the gold visor of his helmet you can see the reflection of the landscape around him. The grey plain, the distant horizon, the black sky, and the tiny figure of Armstrong himself, standing with his camera making the image. It is a photograph about the act of photography, about the relationship between the thing that happens and the thing that is recorded, about the way the observer is always present in the observation, whether or not they intend to be. Kubrick would have loved that photograph, not because it proves anything, not because it supports or refutes any theory, but because it is exactly the kind of image that rewards the kind of looking he demanded from his audiences, the kind of image that contains, if you look long enough, a reflection of itself. The conspiracy theory about Stanley Kubrick and the moon landing will not go away. It has been debunked exhaustively and will be debunked again. New generations will discover it and find in it the same dark thrill. New versions of the theory will emerge, incorporating new details, adapting to new objections, finding new patterns in the films, new suggestive coincidences in the historical record. It will persist because it touches something real, something that is not about the moon at all. It is about the question of whether we can trust the images that define our understanding of the world, whether the most important moments in history are always exactly what they appear to be, whether power, given sufficient motivation and sufficient resources, will always find a way to manage the story, and whether, if it does, we would ever be able to tell. These are not paranoid questions. They are serious questions. They are the questions that serious historians and serious journalists and serious citizens ask about every significant event in recorded history. The conspiracy theory borrows their legitimacy and applies it, in this case, to a target that does not deserve them. But the questions themselves remain, long after the theory is refuted, long after the last person who watched that broadcast in real time has gone. The questions remain. Because trust, genuine, earned, documented trust, is not the same thing as the feeling of trust. And in an age saturated with images, in an age where the tools for constructing convincing representations of events that never happened are available to anyone with a laptop and an internet connection, the gap between the image and the truth it claims to represent is not getting smaller. Stanley Kubrick spent his career making films about that gap, about the terror of it, the seductiveness of it, the way it opens beneath your feet when you look at an image. Long enough and begin to wonder what is on the other side of it,